All right, let's try that again. We had some technical difficulties. Sorry for those of you that were watching and saw the stream just cut out on us. I guess we're just going to start it back over because I don't really know exactly where.
We didn't get much into it anyway, so we're just going to do this one start right back into it. I was asking you about the story that you promised us. You promised us, Nick.
Yeah. I promised to tell a story of our worst injury.
Yeah.
Usually we start these deep dives out by just trying to talk a little bit about each other, get to know each other a little bit more. Noah told us his worst injury story last week. I was kind of going through my worst injury story. So just for the sake of time, we'll go into more detail in it another time. You'll just have to continue to tune in to hear the full story, I guess. But the quick version of it, I was playing in a screamo band with my brother and some friends of mine. It was this punk rock band. We called it Yet, Y-E-T. We got to play like all these really cool venues all over town. We got to play downtown at the New Daisy. We got to play like all these crazy dive bars. And it was a fun experience. We had a really good time. We did that for a few years, and I think this was like a year into really taking the band super seriously and really trying to focus on a lot of the stuff we were doing with the band. We had recorded like a short EP of just a few songs that we were about to release. And to kind of practice for them, we were playing a few just kind of small shows. And our mutual friend, Jaron, actually booked a show, kind of just like a small show for us to get to play some of the new songs and a few things like that.
Was this at the Abbey?
This was not. This was actually at my old home church, Eastwind Christian Church. We used to do shows there. And so we did this show there at the church, and it was a lot of fun. It was funny. We just literally all the bands set up their equipment in the middle of the gym floor at this church, and we brought a lot of people over, and we started playing. And we were really excited because it was like the first time we ever got to headline a show. So we were like at the very top of the bill. We were the last band to come up. We were the last ones to play. So I'd like to think I was just like super into it. I had like a lot of adrenaline going because I was going to be, it was headlining, and people were there to see us specifically. Like we had a pretty good crowd, and the other bands that had played were really cool. Jaron's band, 100 Year Dash, got to play.
Oh, really? Cool.
Yeah, and a couple other friends' bands got to play, and it was just a good time all around. So we get up there. I'm feeling it. I'm usually not somebody that moves around a lot on stage, even though we were like this crazy punk band. But I was just feeling it. I was just really into it, So like we're playing our songs. I'm trying to like rock out. I'm like jumping back and forth. I'm jumping around all over. And so at one point I try to go into like, I guess what I call like a rock power stance, where I just like squat down really far, and I'm like leaned forward. And we're playing loud, like we're playing really loud music. I have permanent hearing damage still, and like ringing in my ears from all those years of playing really loud music. And as I'm leaning forward, even despite how loud all that music was, I swear I heard like a pop sound even over the top of all of that crazy loud music. And my knees just give out from under me, and I just collapse onto the floor right there in that moment. There was no pain in that moment. I didn't know what happened. It felt like my knee just disintegrated or something, and I just fell onto the ground. And it was really funny because the rest of the band, they just thought that I was like rocking out really hard, and I had just like thrown myself on the ground and was just like playing or whatever. So they kept playing the song. And so I'm like just laying on the ground there for like another 60 seconds until the song is over. The song is over. My brother Jeremy, who's the front man, starts talking. He's about to introduce the next song, and he looks over and realizes that I'm still on the ground, like I'm still laying on the ground. And so he like stops it. And he leans over. And he's like, "What? Are you okay? What happened?" And I was just like, "I don't know." And so he's like, "You want to try to stand up?" So they try to get me to stand up, and that's when the pain just like hits me immediately.
Ooh.
I'm like, "Oh no, I can't stand up." I couldn't straighten my leg out basically. And I knew I'd done something to my knee. Like, it was just, like, so much intense pain shooting all up and down my leg.
Was it just one knee or both?
Just one, just my right knee. And so, me being the, like, consummate rock and roll professional that I was, a friend of ours from another band runs into the church kitchen, gets, like, a bag of ice, tapes it to my leg, they sit me down in a chair, and we just finish the set. I finished playing the set with just like an ice bag tape. I was just, rocking out, sitting in my chair, just going hard. So we finished the set. I'm in super intense pain at this point after the set. Of course, there's like a friend that wants to come up and talk to me. We talk for a long time. I'm getting in worse and worse pain. And at this point, it was a late show, so it's like after midnight at this point by the time that we're done. And so I'm thinking, there's no way I can go to the doctor at this point in time. I'll just go in the morning. It'll be fine.
Oh,
I have a pretty good pain tolerance.
So worst mistake ever.
Oh, yeah. I think I've told you this before. I go home. I'm in so much pain I can't sleep. So I try to find something to watch on TV. The only thing on TV was Doctor Who. So I spent like 4 hours watching Doctor Who reruns, and it's like a Pavlovian dog effect.
You got scarred.
Like,
you can't
I can't
watch
Doctor Who without being in pain. Long story short, I go to the doctor the next day. They freak out, and they're like, "Dude, you just tore every ligament in your knee. It's all just shredded in there." And the doctor was like, "What? Are you a football player? What were you doing?" And I was like, "I was playing guitar, rocking out real hard." He said that's the kind of injury he only ever sees in linebackers and football players and stuff like that. So ended up having to have it surgically repaired. Spent the next few months still playing shows sitting down, just with my crazy boot. And yeah, it's sort of all good now. I never got back to 100%, so I still have some pain and swelling in my knees and stuff like that every once in a while. I'm just an old man with old man knees.
Is
at this
it
point.
Can you run, or is it I can't? I'm afraid to run.
I couldn't for a long time.
Okay.
I'm finally getting to a point to where I can, but yeah, man, it was a crazy injury. So that's how I hurt my knee.
I feel like I've gotten pieces of it, but I don't feel like I've had the whole story just laid out in one setting. So that's funny.
Yeah,
I have no memory of you sitting in the chair, and all that was new to me. So that's kind of funny.
Oh, there's lots more details we could go into, but we will save that for another time, because today we have a lot of details to go into, and we want to make sure we have time to kind of fit it all in.
We might not, by the way, so
right.
We'll see.
Right. So this is going to be another Bible drill episode. Pull your Bibles out. Make sure to flip back and forth with us as we're kind of flipping through these different Bible passages. But specifically what we're looking at has to do with the sermon you preached on Sunday. Noah, Sunday you preached on the Beatitudes.
Yep.
The beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus describes the kind of people that are blessed by God.
Yeah.
And the point you made on Sunday was just that lots of times, especially in the church, in the American church especially, we have lost sight of those being the kind of people that are blessed by God.
Yeah.
And we've started pursuing after sometimes the opposite of those beatitude blessed people. And we have started to search, instead of for the poor, we want the rich. Instead of for the meek, we want the powerful. Instead of those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, we want those who are just ready to do whatever needs to be done. And so your call was really for the church to get to a point to where we really learn to value those people the way that God values them. Yeah. But as we were talking today, one of the things we realized is that sometimes it is hard to really understand what do those kind of people look like, and what are kind of examples of those kind of people.
Yeah.
And so one of the cool things is that the Bible, the whole story of the Bible, gives us lots of examples of the kinds of people that fit these categories. And we can kind of continue to see in these stories from the Bible that idea reinforced, that all the way through from the Old Testament to the New Testament, always these have been the kind of people that God desires and the kind of people that are blessed by God, so to say. So, Noah, you've just pulled up a few stories of examples of these kind of people, and we're hoping that by kind of highlighting some of these, you'll get an idea of what the people who are described in the Beatitudes, what they actually look like, and we'll give you some examples just from the Bible.
Yeah.
So, you got anything else to intro it, or you want to just jump straight into the first passage?
So I think there'll be a couple times that we might stop and talk about what they're blessed with. All of the Beatitudes have what they are blessed, who they are, and how they're blessed. But then there's like this little addendum to them that we'll talk about. So I think it'll be back and forth kind of. I might ask you a couple questions every now and then about what you think this means or whatever, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And so it won't just be scripture reading. We'll have some commentary along with it. But let's just go ahead and jump into the first one. Jump straight into it.
All right, what you got for us?
All right, so the Beatitudes drop us straight in saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The passage that I wanted to bring up, it's actually really short, so it won't take us long at all to read this, is in Luke 21, and it's verses 1 through 4. And this is just kind of a random scene in Luke where Jesus and his disciples are walking, I think, through Jerusalem at this point, and they... starts in the first verse 1. As Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. "Truly I tell you," he said, "this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on." And so, really short passage here, but if you really want to know what Jesus, I think, is singling out in this first one, it's someone that has less finances, but still gives in spite of those finances, being less financially able. And I think that's like it's not just, I think you and I have been talking about this a little bit, it's not just that you are in a state of poverty, but it's also what you do with that poverty that makes you blessed, you know? Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of, you've had a lot of convictions that, like, it's not just their status of who they are that makes them, that gives them this blessing, but it's also the things that they do with their status that makes them have that kind of blessing. And so, I don't know, did you want to talk about that a little bit?
With poverty, it's interesting that's the one that the Beatitudes start with, because mm-hmm. this one is probably one of the biggest issues that we have in the church today, mm-hmm. in the American church. And it's for a variety of reasons. And I noticed, we talked about it a little bit, but even while you were preaching on Sunday, I noticed you kind of were struggling with exactly how to explain this point about poverty. Mm-hmm. And part of the issue is that as Americans, we have a strong individual responsibility understanding of the world. Mm-hmm. So we believe that we make decisions, and those decisions have effects in our lives. And especially as Americans, we believe that, and this is starting to change, but the traditional American position is that people who are poor, it's because they have chosen to waste their wealth, to not invest it, to not save for a rainy day, to not go get a better job that pays more than minimum wage. They've made decisions for that, and that's why they're poor. And people who are rich are people who have made decisions that have made them rich. They've invested their money well. They've gone and gotten a good education so that they can get a good job. And so as Americans, we get to this very first beatitude, and we just have a lot of issues with it all of a sudden, because we're just saying, wait, so is Jesus saying that those lazy poor people are the ones that are going to be blessed, and that me, a hardworking rich person, is not going to be blessed?
Yeah.
And there's 2 different issues with that. One is that for the majority of human history, that is not the way that people looked at it, and that's not even the reality of how it actually was. Society was so divided and so stratified that if you were born poor, it didn't matter how much you wanted to, how much you tried, how much you did, you weren't going to be able to move up into the upper classes of the rich. There's just nothing you could do. If you were poor, you were poor. If you were rich, you were rich. You were born into it in some form or another, and there was not really a lot of upwards mobility, a lot of movement into the other tiers. Originally, that's kind of what is supposed to be the promise of the American dream. The promise of America is that America was going to be a land without any of those social distinctions, where people, if long as they worked hard, they were going to be able to be rich, and as long as you didn't, you were going to stay poor. America had a promise of sort of upward mobility, being able to change your status through the things that you do. The conviction that I've come to lately is one, even in America, it's not always about how hard you work. There's a lot of factors outside of people's control that can keep them in a state of poverty. And I think the bigger point that relates to what this passage is talking about specifically is just that wealth in and of itself may not always be a good thing to pursue.
Yeah.
And especially based on what your heart is and where your heart comes from in that. And so one of the things we've talked about all the time is that if you are desiring to be wealthy, you got to ask yourself why that is. And you have to really come to terms with a lot of passages Jesus has where he is just really warning rich people that they aren't really fully experiencing what God has in store for them. And the poor people get a fuller and richer experience sometimes than the rich people do.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest way that comes about, the biggest way that poor people get a fuller experience of God is that when you have wealth, it gives you the illusion that you don't need God. You know, I'm self-sufficient. I can get along on my own. You don't have to sacrifice a lot. Whereas the poor person needs to just rely and trust in God so much more for so many things. And this passage of this widow is a perfect example of it. Because Jesus is saying, these rich people, you know, they're all giving a ton of money to the temple. Look at me. Look at how much money I gave to the temple. But it's easy for them. It's easy for them to do that because they're just giving a small portion of this, like, great wealth that they have. Meanwhile, the widow gives what is monetarily a small amount, but she has to trust God a lot to do that because she's literally giving everything that she has.
Yeah, it's almost as if the more poor you are, the more likely you are to trust in God. Would you say that?
Yeah. Or the more likely you are to recognize your dependence on God, the fact that you need God to survive, because there's no other illusion of self-sufficiency or self-provision that you have. You're not under any sort of illusions. You know that you are a victim to a lot of these forces outside of your control, and God's the only one who can fully be who you put your trust in.
Yeah.
And I think that's what he was saying that this widow illustrated perfectly. She just illustrated the fact that she trusts God, you know, so much so that she's willing to give the last 2 pennies that she has. And I think the biggest reason it is for that is just because poor people are just aware of how many factors are outside of their control in so many ways. Even in America. And that's my big conviction.
Yeah.
Even in the U.S., there are factors outside of our control that will keep poor people poor. And poor people know that. They know that there's things outside of their control that is the reason, part of the reason they're poor. And because of that, they are more willing to also cede control to God himself.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the huge things you can always see in this story.
That's awesome. I don't think I can make that point better. So
cool.
I think we're just going to move on from that. All right. So the next one is, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And the one I chose for this might be a little bit more obscure. It's a little bit longer of one. But I really, this passage has always been really dear to me. It's from 1 Samuel chapter 1. And this is the story of Hannah. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zophite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, and an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Years after, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni were priests of the Lord. Those are important for Samuel, but not at the moment. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife, Peninnah, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her. And the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. When Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Once, when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you would only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk, and said to her, How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. That's really telling, by the way, that they're in the temple of the Lord, and Eli just assumes people are drunk while they're praying. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. She said, May your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning, they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, Because I asked the Lord for him. So, a lot about what this passage is, you can tell it's about grief and it's about mourning, right? Mm-hmm. She's so overcome by the fact that she doesn't have a kid that she stops eating, you know. Mm-hmm. And I've actually encountered a lot of people that are so grieved that they just lose their appetite entirely. I remember even sometimes in my own life where that's happened, and the only thing I could keep down was like milk. And so I've always resonated with the story, because I feel like if there was a story that you were to cut out of the Bible and just kind of put like what we're doing here, the story of Hannah really is one of the prime examples of someone suffering through sorrow and being downcast. And what I love about this is that in the context of it, you know, Elkanah is not an awful husband. Like Elkanah, her husband loves her, mm-hmm. you know, and is intentionally trying to rid her of that mourning. You know, he's not like this awful husband that's just like, you know, drawn away or anything. Like he's intentionally, look, like I love you. Like, aren't I more to you than 10 sons? Which is really sweet. But even the best that Elkanah can do for Hannah is not enough to overcome this mourning that she has, you know? And that always struck me, is that like she's so overcome with the fact that she doesn't have children, that she goes to make sacrifices at the temple like they're supposed to do. She's following the law of the Torah. Mm-hmm. She is intentionally looking to God to satisfy this grief, because she knows that's the only thing that really can satisfy this. She wants this son. And so, yeah, she goes so far as to say that, like, if you satisfy this longing that's in my heart, the first son I have, like he might be the only son I have, I will give back to you. Like this is almost as if like you're asking for something that you're never going to actually participate in, you know? Yeah. Like if she gives Samuel to the Lord, he won't be in the house. He's going to be in the temple. He will live out his life.
She's not going to get to enjoy her son.
Yeah, she's not going to get to enjoy her son. Like this is one of those moments where she prays to God, not only for son, but also says, I will, if you give me this, you know, I will give him back. And like, you know, to get to that point where you are not even really wanting the pleasure of the son anymore. You just want to have one. Like that to me is like a whole nother level of grief and mourning and really just desire that I think is beautiful. And so I don't know. I thought that this story might be one that really resonates with a lot of people that are also feeling like this, and feeling like they have been wanting something or desiring something for a very long time, and haven't received it. And yeah, I don't know. This has just always been a very encouraging and uplifting passage to me. I don't know. How does it hit you? I'm curious.
Well, it kind of connects with something that both me and you have had conversations of a lot, which is that the church, the modern church, really prioritizes joy, which is good, and like happiness. And like, we're so happy. And a lot of the songs we sing in church are like, God is so great, God is so good, life is so good, things are so good, all this kind of stuff. And what that ends up doing is that a lot of people who are suffering because their lives are bad, they've had to go through a lot of heartache in their lives. Or maybe they're just the certain kind of personality that has a really hard time ignoring how bad the world actually is. And so they're like, this just feels fake to me. Like the world is horrible sometimes.
Yeah.
The world is a sad place. There's a lot of sadness and a lot of grief and a lot of bad things going on in the world. And so these types of people who are either going through grief themselves or who are just very well acquainted with grief find themselves kind of not being able to connect well with church and with a lot of churches. And so both Jesus's statement in the Beatitudes, which is blessed are those who mourn, but also this story of a woman who just wants a child so bad and who is just really well acquainted with that grief, I think just really do help to illustrate that if you are one of those people who has gone through a lot of grief in your life, or if you're just one of those people who feels like I can't just ignore how bad the world is, then it might actually be a good thing. You might actually be somebody who is blessed by God in a weird roundabout way. And there's various different reasons for that. This is something that could be kind of its own whole podcast episode in some ways.
Well, we kind of did. We talked about this a little bit in one of our episodes a little while back.
Yeah.
I'll link it, the persecution and like sadness and stuff right before the joy episode.
Absolutely, yeah. And so that is definitely something that requires us to kind of change how we look at things a little bit and realize that it's really easy for us to like write people off like that or to try to get them away from us. But we got to step back and think, maybe these are people that are blessed by God. And it's really, I do like that you brought up this story, because this is something that gets brought up a lot in church circles when I hear about is just like this issue specifically. There's couples and out there who are trying to conceive and they just want children so bad. And this is one of the greatest pains that a lot of people can experience, is that wanting a child so bad and not being able to have one. And I think that if that is you, this is a good example of a story where you can just be like, I'm not somebody that's been like forgotten by God. I'm not somebody that God doesn't see.
Yeah.
In fact, I am somebody that God has like his sights directly set on. And I think that's just something that we need to always kind of keep in mind, is the fact that those who mourn are blessed by God.
Yeah, and they'll be comforted. That's really what it ends with, is those that mourn will be comforted, which I think is really beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that passage at the end of the book of Revelation. It's like one of the very last verses in the whole Bible, but it says that it describes the kind of new reality of the new heavens and the new earth, and it says that it's a place where God will wipe away every tear. It's going to comfort those who mourn, and it's just a fulfillment of this beatitude.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, so that's the mourners, kind of an example of someone that was deep in mourning. Now we're going to turn to the meek. And for that story, I have one pulled up. This one's going to be an odd one, by the way, so just be on the lookout. Things always get odd when you go to Numbers. But this is going to be in Numbers chapter 12. And we're going to be focusing in on Moses now. So starting in chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron, that would be Moses' sister and brother, began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? They asked. Hasn't he also spoken through us? And the Lord heard this. Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. At once the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, "Come out to the tent of meeting, all three of you." So the three of them went out. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance to the tent and summoned Aaron and Miriam. When the two of them stepped forward, he said, "Listen to my words. When there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" The anger of the Lord burned against them, and he left them. When the cloud lifted from above the tent, Miriam's skin was leprous. It became as white as snow. Aaron turned toward her and saw that she had a defiling skin disease. And he said to Moses, "Please, my Lord, I ask you not hold against us the sin we have so foolishly committed. Do not let her be like a stillborn infant coming from its mother's womb, with its flesh half eaten away." So Moses cried to the Lord, "Please, God, heal her." The Lord replied to Moses, "If her father had spit in her face, would she not have been in disgrace for 7 days? Confine her outside the camp for 7 days. After that, she can be brought back." So Miriam was confined outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not move on till she was brought back. After that, the people left Hazeroth and encamped in the desert of Paran. So it's not a fun story. We don't even know if Miriam was cleansed or not. I think she ends up getting it. The whole put her out in the camp for 7 days is part of the Torah law. Whenever you have a skin disease, you've got to be pushed away from the rest of the community. And it's usually part of the purification rituals as well. So she probably was. But here's a situation in which Moses has been the leader of the Israelites for quite a while now. And his brother and sister decide that, he's not necessarily doing the right thing, marrying this Cushite, and think that they're better at leading than he is. And you notice that he doesn't really stick up for himself. It's not really, he just kind of, that's in verse 3, the author of whoever, I don't think Moses wrote this, because it'd be really funny if Moses wrote that himself and said, "Now Moses was a really meek man." But it would be a really meek thing for to say, is that you're meek.
The most humble man in all the
earth. But whoever the author of this was, put in this little note right there saying that Moses was a very meek person. And the whole context of the story is that he doesn't feel like he can stand up to his brother and sister in this point. So God specifically has to call out Aaron and Miriam, which would be a very terrifying thing to be called, and then this pillar of cloud is right in front of you. But you can see that God is actually defending Moses in this story against his own brother and sister. And so I don't know, with this story in particular, there's a lot of times I see in our life today where there are people that just oftentimes try and avoid conflict at all costs. They don't, and not necessarily because they're afraid of conflict. It's more that they are unable to deal with it. They're unable to really fight for what they believe in. And Moses struck me in this passage in particular as being one of these people that has a really hard time dealing with that. And I think it's beautiful that God goes out of his way to solve an internal family squabble, between Moses, Miriam, and Aaron, because Moses can't, And in the Beatitudes passage, it says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." And inheritance is this idea of, you're going to receive blessings and things from the earth. You're going to receive this bountiful harvest and things, not because you did anything, right? Inheritance is all based off of birth, and so I don't know. I find a lot of the beauty of what he's saying in this meekness point is that people that don't have the ability to be able to fight for what they need or for what they want, God will take care of them, and they will inherit the things they need.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. This point has always been an interesting one for me, because one of my favorite books I read recently is a book called After You Believe
Mm-hmm.
by N.T. Wright, a theologian that both me and you reference a lot. And he made a really good point about how there are certain things that Christians value, you know, things like simplicity, poverty. And a big one that he mentioned is humility. You know, Christians shouldn't, you know, probably the key word is shouldn't. Whether they do or don't is maybe a different question. But Christians should not be the kind of people who like someone that's constantly out there being like really proud and like, look at everything that I've done. Look at how awesome I am. Look at everything I've accomplished. Christians are the people who value people who are humble, people who aren't like loud and in your face about who they are, but people who are just kind of like meek and humble and in the background a little bit. And N.T. Wright's point is that before Christianity, this point was unheard of. There was no culture in the world that thought being humble was a good thing. If for all of them, being humble just meant you're going to be trampled on. Being humble just meant that people are going to walk all over you. It just meant that the Miriams and Aarons of the world are going to take what's yours, and you're going to lose it all because you're that person who's unwilling to stand up and fight for what's mine. But the Christians reading the Beatitudes and the whole of the scriptures and understanding that God opposes the proud, but shows grace to the humble. You know, it's a famous verse. God is actually set up against the proud. And that's what you see here. He like afflicts these proud people with disease, but instead shows grace and stands up for those who are humble. I think it just like cements that point down even harder, which is just that God doesn't like the kind of people who are out there really bombastically talking about all of the amazing things that they have done, but instead he shows grace to those that are humble in a lot of ways. The story I think of is a story Jesus tells later about when you go to a dinner party, and he talks about the people who immediately go to like the head of the table and are assuming they're probably the most important, most distinguished guest, so I need to go to the head of the table. And then they get embarrassed because a more important, distinguished, powerful person comes, and they have to lose their seat at the head of the table. He says, instead, be humble, be the kind of person that God, desires you to be. You know, just take your seat at the end of the table. Let other people be the ones that kind of get raised up and praised. And who knows? You may end up getting sort of the extra honor of having the guest say, "No, don't sit over there. Come here. You need to sit at the head of the table." That's the sort of they will inherit the earth part of it thing. I think you're eventually going to get your due. I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize. There's a lot of people out there that are like working super hard every day, never getting any recognition for it. And so if you're not getting recognized, no respect, I'm not getting any respect. I'm getting no recognition. Nobody notices what I do. You have two options in front of you. One is you can start proclaiming from the rooftops, look at everything that I'm doing, pay attention to all the things that I do. You can start fighting for your own recognition. Or you can be humble and let God be the one that brings you to the head of the table. Let God be the one that eventually gives you the recognition that you deserve. And I think you have that promise of that. There is that promise in the Bible that you will get that recognition. Maybe just not now. And the key is your attitude in the meantime.
Yeah, and a point you've made previously that I think is good to bring up there is sometimes God will do that through other humans that are better humans. Sometimes a human will bring you to the front of the table. And that is God doing that. Sometimes you'll meet someone that does value you for what you're doing, and I don't know. I think that's the great part of it is sometimes God works through humanity to achieve those ends. So
one of my biggest desires here recently is to be the kind of person who makes sure I recognize when other people are putting that work in, and just give them a little foretaste of that recognition that they're ultimately going to get. And so I think that's something we as Christians can do a lot. Notice those humble people. Notice the people that aren't tooting their own horn, and instead let's toot the horn for them.
I think that's awesome.
That we can really do.
All right, so we're making our way. We'll see. We got 14 minutes, so we'll see how far we get. But next one is, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. This one is actually a parable that Jesus told in Luke chapter 18. This starts out, Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. He said, "In a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what the people thought. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, 'Grant me justice against my adversary.' For some time he refused, but finally he said to himself, 'Even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so that she won't eventually come and attack me.' And the Lord said, 'Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones, who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?'" All righty.
Yeah, this one's cool. This one's very timely because I really think I think justice is what is at the forefront for so much of our culture. I think the last year, this is just the conversation I just keep coming back to over and over and over again. It's about like we want the bad people to get what's coming to them. We want the good people to get the justice that they deserve. So this is something that we're just like always talking about.
Should we explain a little bit of like why righteousness and justice mean the same thing? Do we want to tackle that? Or?
Yeah, I think you can kind of quickly explain that a little bit. But
so the idea is righteousness is kind of hard because it's a Hebrew word. I mean, it's a word that has lost a lot of meaning in our culture today. I think most people, when they hear the word righteousness, probably just think morally good, be a good person. And so when they read this, I think they think, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for being a good person. Like, I think that's how people read that. That's not really what righteousness means. The best English use of righteousness I've found is not even the full word, but it's the phrase to do right by another person. When I say I'm doing right by that person, right, I'm not saying I'm technically saying I'm doing good, but I'm really more what I'm saying is I'm doing what's expected and like legally the best for that person, right? And if I'm doing right by you, then I'm doing all the things that are good in our agreement and relationship with one another for you, right? And so righteousness is way more related to this idea of agreements and pacts between two parties, and being fair to that. I'm doing right by you and being fair to you really are synonymous, right? And that's really why we get to this kind of idea of justice is about being right, being true, being fair to people apart from you. Being seeking justice is seeking that rightness, seeking that fairness that we want in relationship with other people. Do I need to say that better?
No, that makes sense.
Okay, cool.
And so the two kind of go together. And like I said, it's a very timely thing. It's something that we're very concerned about a lot of times. A lot of ways, for us, righteousness and justice come through in the way that this widow is, where it's like, I want my enemies to be judged. I want them to get what's coming to them. I want them to have the consequences of their pain that they've caused me come to fruition. Yeah. And it's such an interesting parable because it's very clear from the beginning that this isn't like a good judge. This guy's like not really very fair, super selfish, doesn't really care. But the point Jesus is making in the parable is that this widow is so persistent that even this horrible judge that is super selfish and not just in his judgments, even this guy is kind of like, man, I just got to get her off my back. It's kind of that squeaky wheel gets the oil kind of thing. You just got to be that squeaky wheel. She's that squeaky wheel. And it's interesting because it seems like a part of the application that Jesus is calling for us to do is that we need to have that same level of just like never being satisfied until things are right. that widow does. And constantly going to God as the judge, the good judge, who is constantly described in the Bible as a good and just and righteous judge. We need to be that kind of squeaky wheel, that persistent person that's always going to God, asking for things to be put right. But I think it's really important, and this has been one of my biggest convictions here recently. What this is not saying that we need to go seek justice for ourselves.
Yeah, we're not. Don't be a Batman.
Absolutely. The point is not that this widow needs to go out and kill her enemies.
Mm-hmm.
She understands that her job is to appeal to the judge and let the judge be the one that executes judgment. And this has kind of been the distinction that's been hard. Obviously, as Christians, we are people who are for justice,
right,
and having things right. And obviously, we want that judgment to be executed. But a very clear distinction that you see all the way through the New Testament is that God is the one who executes that justice.
Yeah.
Not us. And Jesus, in fact, at different points in time says if somebody wrongs you, you don't seek revenge. It's God's position to do that. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. I think the biggest one is that we're always really bad at seeking revenge. We don't ever give people exactly what they deserve. We one-up them, and then it's just constantly back and forth one-upping, constantly making things worse, constantly going back at each other even worse. We're just really bad at revenge.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't be the ones that execute that anyways. But I think more fundamentally, it's just the fact that that's not our place. God is the judge. We're not the judges. God is the one who ends up ultimately judging right and wrong and ultimately dishing out what those people deserve. And so our job is to be the kind of people who desire that justice and who constantly sort of entreat God to execute that justice. And he's just saying, if this unjust judge does it for this woman, how much more is God going to do it for his own people?
Yeah.
I think that's a really cool thing. And so that's been my conviction here recently. Whenever you see injustice, whatever injustice that you see, use it as an opportunity to go to God and continue to be that squeaky wheel that is just asking God to bring justice.
Yeah, it's that hunger, that persistence. You know how I think he uses the imagery of hunger and thirst because once you're hungry, your stomach never stops telling you're hungry. You know, it's gonna growl until you eat.
Absolutely.
And I think that's kind of the thing is make your desire for justice to be that kind of hunger,
right.
That really pushes you to God and hungering and thirsting for God to make this right. So
right.
I think that's great.
Absolutely. And I do want to make one more point. This is maybe unrelated. This may almost kind of counteract what I was saying before.
Oh, no.
But this is a distinction that I think is important to make when it's talking about this issue. I think this issue has to do, especially when other people wrong us, when other people sin against us, when we have enemies in life. It's not our job to enact that justice.
Yeah.
I think our job is to go to God and ask God to enact that justice. However, if we are the source of the injustice, if we are the people who are wrong, if we are the ones who have sinned against other people, if we are the ones who are the problem, I don't think our job is to go to God and tell him to fix it. We have a responsibility then at that point to do something about it. And so
otherwise asking for justice would be asking for God to punish you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think a lot of times people will use these passages where it says you got to go to God as ways to counteract social justice warriors, people that are all about social justice. They'll be like, well, this world's always going to be unjust. It's our job to go to God to bring justice. And I'm like, yeah, that is true in a lot of things. There's a lot of things we don't have control over. But if I'm the source of the problem in some way or another, if I'm that rich person who is keeping poor people poor, if I am that white person who is keeping people of other races and other ethnicities in somewhat lesser positions, then I need to do something about that.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves lots of times is, how am I a part of the problem? Am I a part of injustice? And what can I do to fix it? And this is something you see a lot in the Old Testament prophets. I've started seeing this over and over again. God is super upset with the Israelite people because they are the ones that are being unjust.
Yep.
They are the sources of injustice. And he's telling them, you're cheating the poor, you're hurting the widows and the orphans. You guys are the problem. And you see a lot of God's most intense anger when his people are the source of injustice.
Yep. I was reading Amos the other day and just finished it, and it's a beautiful book because it starts out with God like judging all the nations. Like it criticized like Gaza and like Damascus and all these other nations other than Judah and Israel, and it's always like very theatrical. For 3 sins, nay, even 4 sins, you are at fault for this. And like, you know, you can just imagine like an Israelite reading this and being like, oh yeah, Damascus totally deserves that,
them,
you know,
God,
totally deserves that. And so he works his way in the first 2 chapters just criticizing all those nations, and then he gets to Judah, and you know, this is preached in Israel, so you know, that's their neighbor, and he gets to Judah, and like I'm sure they're like roaring like, yes, Judah's awful, they're hypocrites and all this stuff, because you know they've divided at this point and they hate him. And so
for people that don't know, the country of Israel at one point divides to the northern country of Israel and the southern country of Judah. So they have a civil war and they divide between the north and the south.
And so they're in the middle of this civil war, and Israel's hearing
this prophecy is being written to Israel, the northern kingdom, and it gets to Judah, the southern kingdom. And you can just imagine these Israelite northerners being like, oh yeah, God's been laying into all these other countries, now he's going to lay into the people of Judah.
And he does. He calls them hypocrites and all this different stuff, and you can just hear the Israelites being like, yes. And then the rest of the book, he's like, and for Israel.
Now for Israel.
And then all of Israel's completely different. Israel is specifically focused on people that are doing all of these cheating people, doing bribes so that people don't get the right justice in court. And it's all this focus on people that are just not seeking justice. Instead, they're seeking their own gains and seeking to advance their wealth. So it's a powerful book. Go read Amos. Amos is great. But it's I think that comes across the most of what you're saying. So,
and I'm super passionate about this because I do think we are in a state and time right now where our whole world, our nation especially, is hungering and thirsting for righteousness and for justice. And so I guess just to sum it up, and we can kind of continue with this a little bit more next week.
Because I got like another 5 to go through, so we'll say this is part 1. And then we can do part 2 next week.
But to sum it up, when you find yourself being that person that's hungering and thirsting for righteousness, I think you have 2 options, 2 things that you got to ask yourself. One is, am I contributing to this injustice in some form? And if you are, I think you have a responsibility to right that. God's going to hold you accountable for that. And I think you see that throughout the whole scripture. God wants his people especially to not be people who are sources of injustice. So you got to take that seriously. I think you always got to start there. That's a version of like, take the plank out of your own eye before you start searching for the speck in others. But I do think if you've done that work and if you've just decided this is one of those situations where there's just other evil forces and people at work that are responsible for this injustice, then the next responsibility you have is to go to God as the judge and ask him to make things right, and ask him to persistently be the one that is going before God and asking him to bring that justice and to hunger and thirst for that righteousness. And I think those are huge things that I'm really passionate about, because I've just seen when the church does that, it's huge. Everybody's down for that. Everyone wants to see justice served. And so when we do that as Christians, I think that's huge. I think it's one of the best things that we can do. One of the most important things we can do as Christians. So besides that, we got 5 more, like you said. We're going to keep going. Tune into part 2 next week, next Wednesday. I would also encourage you, tune in this Sunday, hear the following sermon also from Noah, where he's going to continue to take us in through the Sermon on the Mount a little bit more. I think you're going to really enjoy it. I would encourage you to, just tune in, watch it with us live, or watch it sometime later on on Facebook and YouTube. And if you are listening to this podcast, this is something we haven't asked yet, but I know it's important for podcasts in general. If you're listening to this podcast, whether it's on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, wherever it is that you're listening to it, I'd encourage you, just leave a review or a rating about the podcast. I know that with podcasts specifically, that helps a lot. It helps a lot of people find out what we're doing and what we're about. And we just, want to see this podcast get out to a few more people. So we would super appreciate any of y'all doing that. Just take a second, go in, leave a rating and review of the podcast, and help us get out to more people. But either way, We hope to see y'all this Sunday for our Sunday service and next week for part 2 of this deep dive. We'll see y'all then.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.